You're going to hear about my part, doing all types of crazy things just because we want to have a good time. Diddy thought $50 million would buy him freedom, but when the judge slammed the door on his bail request twice, things took a dark turn. Rumors are flying that he didn't take it well and may have even threatened the judge. On September 17, Diddy's day in court arrived. It was his first appearance since his shocking arrest, and the general consensus was that he wouldn't stay locked up for long. After all, this was Diddy, an empire-building, multimillionaire mogul. Surely, throwing enough money at the situation would secure his freedom, right? Well, not quite. Diddy entered the courtroom calm and collected, ready to deploy all the resources he could muster. His legal team wasn't playing games, they came prepared to put an astronomical $50 million on the table for his bail. This wasn't your average cash offer, it was Diddy going all in. His team proposed using his $48 million Miami mansion as collateral for the bond. Imagine offering an entire mansion to prove you're not a flight risk. To add even more weight, they threw in his mother's house as well, a sign of just how serious they were. As if that wasn't enough, they surrendered every passport they could find, Diddy's, his mom's, and even his daughter's, showing that they had no plans to flee. This was not a regular bail offer, it was a desperate bid to get out of jail at any cost. Offering $50 million, one of the highest bail amounts ever seen, was a clear message that Diddy was serious about facing the charges. It was an attempt to prove he wouldn't dodge the accusations and would remain available for the court proceedings. However, despite the hefty sum, the charges he faced were far from ordinary. These weren't minor infractions, they were severe allegations with the potential for significant prison time. For someone like Diddy, who spent decades dominating the music industry, these accusations were a shocking revelation. The prosecution argued that Diddy wasn't just a party host, he allegedly orchestrated everything that went down, turning what seemed like star-studded celebrations into something far more sinister. The allegations painted him as someone who had controlled operations behind the scenes for years. Even with $50 million on the line, the court wasn't swayed. Judge Robin Tarnowski denied the bail request, citing the severity of the charges and the risk Diddy posed. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting that Diddy had reached out to witnesses and victims before his arrest, not to apologize, but to influence their narratives. This raised significant red flags, signaling a potential obstruction of justice. Judge Tarnowski wasn't fazed by the money, mansions, or passports. Known for her no-nonsense approach, she saw Diddy as a flight risk, someone with vast resources who could easily interfere with witnesses or disrupt the case. Her decision to deny bail sent a message: no amount of wealth could override the legal system, especially with charges of this magnitude. So, despite the massive wealth and influence he wielded, Diddy remained behind bars. His $50 million bid for freedom was a stark reminder that money doesn't always guarantee an escape from accountability, especially when the stakes are this high. The world flies private jets like they're Ubers, and for someone like Diddy, with his immense resources and connections, disappearing without a trace wouldn't be impossible if he truly wanted to. Sure, Diddy's legal team handed over his passport and those of his family members, but for someone of his caliber, passports are just a minor obstacle. He could easily be sipping cocktails on a secluded beach in a country without an extradition treaty with the US in no time. Judge Tarnowski wasn't about to take that chance, especially given the gravity of the charges Diddy is facing. These are serious crimes, the kind that can lead to decades behind bars. For a judge like Tarnowski, letting someone with Diddy's level of money and influence walk out on bail posed a massive risk. If he were to flee, it wouldn't just be a blow to the court's credibility, it would mean the victims might never see justice. Another major factor in denying Diddy's bail was the accusation of witness tampering. Prosecutors claimed that, far from waiting quietly for his day in court, Diddy had been actively reaching out to witnesses and victims before his arrest, trying to win them over to his side and push his version of events. That kind of behavior sets off alarm bells for any judge. If Diddy was already trying to influence witnesses while awaiting his trial, what would stop him from doing so again if he were released? Tarnowski saw these red flags and wasn't willing to take the risk. The prosecution came armed with hard evidence, phone records, emails, and even testimonies from witnesses who alleged Diddy had contacted them. This wasn't a baseless claim, it was supported by solid proof, making it nearly impossible for Diddy's legal team to argue against. Diddy's lawyers came into the courtroom confident, believing their $50 million bail offer would be enough to secure his release. They even sweetened the deal by offering up Diddy's Miami mansion and his mother's house, along with all their passports, as proof of their commitment. To further reassure the court, they proposed house arrest with GPS monitoring. They argued that Diddy wasn't a flight risk, pointing out that he had voluntarily flown to New York to face the charges and hadn't attempted to run when he learned of the investigation. However, Tarnowski wasn't convinced. The judge viewed the risk as too high, and Diddy's past actions didn't help his case. His legal team wasn't done, though. After their initial request was denied, they filed an appeal, hoping a different judge might be more sympathetic. This time, U.S. District Judge Andrew L. Carter was brought in to review the case. Diddy's lawyers knew they had to offer more than just money, so they proposed stricter conditions, weekly tests, house arrest with restricted visitors, and even a rule barring any female visitors except family members. Despite these concessions, Judge Carter also denied the appeal. The prosecution highlighted Diddy's history of public altercations and anger issues, arguing that his release posed a risk not only to witnesses but also to others involved in the case. They presented examples of Diddy's temper flaring in the past, using this to emphasize the potential danger of letting him out on bail. The court wasn't swayed, even by the promise of strict monitoring. The issue wasn't just whether Diddy would behave himself under house arrest, it was the concern that his influence could still allow him to manipulate the case from behind the walls of his Miami mansion. The court feared he could reach out to witnesses, attempt to control the narrative, and ultimately jeopardize the trial's integrity. After the second bail denial, rumors began to swirl. Whispers suggested that, in his frustration, Diddy may have made veiled threats against Judge Tarnowski. While there's no concrete evidence to confirm this, the speculation raised questions about how far Diddy might go when faced with such a dire situation. For someone who's lived a life of privilege and power, being stuck in a jail cell might push them to the edge. Whether the alleged threats were real or just courtroom gossip, the situation underscored the tension surrounding the case. Threaten Tarnowski? Given the situation, it's not impossible. Diddy has always been a man who plays hard, both in business and in his personal life. With his entire empire at stake, you can bet he's feeling the pressure. He's already seen one judge reject his bail, and now a second one, Judge Andrew L. Carter, has slammed the door in his face too. That kind of back-to-back defeat could push even the calmest person to the edge, let alone someone as powerful and used to winning as Diddy. It's not like Diddy is new to making bold moves either. For years, he's been known as a guy who doesn't take no for an answer. But if these rumors are true, this isn't just his usual aggressive style. It's one thing to be facing charges, but adding a threat to a federal judge into the mix. That's the kind of thing that can take an already bad situation and make it catastrophically worse. Maybe Diddy did let his temper get the best of him, and in a moment of desperation, he said something he shouldn't have. He's got a history of flying off the handle, and this could easily be another case of that happening. Or maybe it's just talk. Rumors spread like wildfire, especially when someone like Diddy is involved. People love to speculate, and with the high stakes and media circus surrounding his case, it's no wonder gossip is flying. Whether there's any truth to it or not, the damage is done. The rumor is out there, and now everyone's talking about it. But let's get real about why this is such a big deal. If it turns out that Diddy did, in fact, threaten Tarnowski, it could lead to even more legal trouble for him. And we're not talking about minor trouble. A threat against a judge is a serious federal offense. We're talking about additional charges that could extend his prison sentence by years, maybe even decades if he's convicted. It would add another layer to the already massive pile of charges he's facing, and it's not something the court is going to take lightly. What makes this rumor even more dangerous for Diddy is that he's already on thin ice with accusations of witness tampering and influencing victims. The last thing he needs is another claim that he's using threats to get what he wants. If there's any truth to these allegations, it paints a picture of a man who will stop at nothing to escape the consequences of his actions. That's exactly what the prosecution is trying to prove in court, that Diddy isn't just a wealthy businessman caught up in bad decisions, but a man who has been using his power and influence to bend the law for years. The harsh reality, Diddy's new life at MDC Brooklyn. When Diddy's bail was denied for the second time, there was only one place he was headed, the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn. This place is no joke. It's not one of those cushy white-collar prisons you hear about for celebrities or wealthy folks who get into trouble. MDC is notorious for its conditions, and the stories that come out of there make it sound like something straight out of a nightmare. For someone like Diddy, who's used to living in mansions, flying on private jets, and being surrounded by luxury 24/7, MDC must feel like stepping into hell. Imagine going from having everything at your fingertips to being locked in a cell for days on end, with no phone calls, no fresh air, and no visits from the outside world. That's the reality Diddy's living in right now, and from what we hear, it's not going well for him. The conditions at MDC are beyond rough. Inmates are often stuck in lockdown for days at a time, sometimes even longer. That means no calls, no visits, and no chance to even take a shower. Can you imagine Diddy, who probably hasn't gone a day without luxury in decades, suddenly being thrown into that kind of situation? It's a far cry from the life he's used to, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. Instead of lounging by the pool, Diddy's now dealing with overcrowded cells, horrible food, and a lack of basic hygiene. Talk about a reality check. But that's not the worst of it. MDC has a reputation for being chaotic and dangerous, and it's not just the inmates who make it that way. The facility is notorious for being severely understaffed, which only makes things more unpredictable. Fights break out all the time, and the guards are often stretched too thin to keep things under control. Then there's the contraband. MDC is crawling with it, and believe it or not, some of the guards are allegedly involved in smuggling. That means Diddy's not just stuck in a dirty, overcrowded prison, he's in a place where anything can happen at any time, with no guarantee of safety. For a guy like Diddy, who's always been in control, this must be his worst nightmare. But at MDC, none of that matters. He's just another inmate, and all the money and power in the world can't change the fact that he's locked up in one of the toughest prisons in the country. The transition must be jarring, to say the least. Think about it, Diddy's entire life has been about excess. Mansions, yachts, designer clothes, private jets, he's built his brand on living large. And now, all of that's been stripped away. Instead of lounging in his Miami mansion or jetting off to a tropical island, he's stuck in a tiny cell, surrounded by other inmates, some of whom have been in the system for years. The luxury, the freedom, the control, it's all gone, and you can bet he's feeling the impact of that every single day. The conditions at MDC are so bad that inmates have been complaining for years, but nothing seems to change. There are stories of people being denied basic necessities like food and medical care, and inside the facility, it's chaos. For someone like Diddy, who's always had the best of everything, adjusting to this kind of life must feel like torture. So how's Diddy handling it? From what we've heard, not well. He's been described as frustrated, angry, and struggling to adapt to his new surroundings. And who can blame him? This is a world he never imagined he'd be part of, and it's testing him in ways he's never been tested before. Isn't the life he's used to, but the reality is, unless something changes with his case, this could be Diddy's new normal for a long time. The arrest, how Diddy got taken in on September 16th, was just supposed to be another day for him, but we now know it was anything but. The charges were looming, and Diddy knew something was coming. His legal team had already been preparing for the inevitable. But what no one could have predicted was just how quickly everything would unravel. The feds were closer than Diddy thought, and he had no idea how soon they'd be closing in on him. It's wild to think that just hours before his arrest, Diddy was out in the world, completely unaware of the storm brewing. So picture this, Diddy, the man who's been at the top of the music game for decades, is just casually hanging out in Central Park. He's with his son, Christian, and to anyone watching, it probably looked like a completely normal day, just another billionaire enjoying a sunny afternoon in the city. Diddy had that calm, untouchable air about him, like nothing could faze him. But while he was out there living it up, the feds were already putting their plan into action. It's almost surreal when you think about it. One minute Diddy is chilling with his son, and the next, everything's about to come crashing down. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the feds were closing in on him, and in less than 24 hours, his whole world would change. It was the kind of plot twist you'd expect in a movie, not real life. But this is Diddy we're talking about. Nothing about his life is ever boring. Fast forward just a few hours, and things start to take a sudden turn. Diddy is still out and about, moving through the city like he doesn't have a care in the world. He was seen hanging out with some friends, cracking jokes, and looking completely at ease. There wasn't a hint of worry on his face. It was almost like he thought he was untouchable, like the legal troubles looming over him were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But the clock was ticking, and the feds were getting closer. The wild indictment, Diddy's dark side exposed. This wasn't some small-time case, it was about exposing a side of Diddy's life that had been kept hidden from the public for years. The indictment was packed with shocking details, and at the center of it all were the infamous parties, elaborate, twisted events that Diddy allegedly organized for his own pleasure. These parties weren't just regular gatherings, they were meticulously planned events. According to the indictment, Diddy didn't just throw parties and call it a day. No, this was on another level. Every detail was arranged with precision, from the venue setup to the exact timing of everything. It was clear that these weren't spur-of-the-moment parties, they were calculated and carefully orchestrated events designed to fulfill Diddy's twisted desires. But it didn't stop at planning. Once the parties were in full swing, things would often take a turn. Multiple reports from the indictment alleged that Diddy wasn't just a passive observer at these parties. The description in the indictment painted a disturbing picture of someone used to getting what he wanted no matter the cost. When the feds raided Diddy's homes, they didn't just find the usual luxuries you'd expect from a billionaire. No, what they uncovered was far more disturbing. They found bottles of baby oil and lubricant. This wasn't just hearsay anymore. The physical evidence was right there, and it backed up the allegations that had been swirling for months. The raids on Diddy's properties were a turning point in the case. Before that, it was all rumors and accusations, but once the feds got their hands on concrete evidence, everything changed. The scale of these parties, the level of organization, became undeniable. It was clear that this wasn't just a man who liked to party hard, this was something much darker. What's most shocking? The most shocking thing is how well Diddy managed to hide all of this for so long. For years, the public saw him as a charismatic, successful businessman who built an empire from the ground up. But behind the scenes, there was another side to him. The indictment ripped the mask off, revealing the true nature of someone who had been using his power and influence to harm others. The RICO charges. Here are the details about the RICO charges against Diddy, because trust me, this is no small thing. When you hear about the RICO Act, it's usually in connection with big-time cartels, not music moguls. So why is Diddy being hit with charges under the RICO Act? Well, that's because the RICO Act is reserved for taking down organized crime, and in this case, prosecutors are alleging that Diddy's entire operation fits the bill. The RICO Act was created in 1970 as a way to dismantle organizations by going after the big fish, the leaders who pull the strings, even if they are not the ones getting their hands dirty. It's a serious law used when the government believes someone has been running an operation over a long period of time with multiple crimes tying back to a central enterprise. It's not just about one-off offenses, it's about a pattern of activity. And once someone is hit with RICO charges, the penalties are steep. We're talking decades in prison, massive fines, and the complete dismantling of their entire operation. So yeah, it's a huge deal. Prosecutors are saying that Diddy didn't just occasionally step over the line, he built an enterprise that spanned decades, with numerous crimes tying back to it. Over a decade, and they are ready to prove it. According to the charges, Diddy's operation wasn't just about music and entertainment. The worst part is that this wasn't something he was doing alone. Diddy had a whole crew of associates working with him, and they weren't just business partners, these were his enforcers, the people who helped keep the operation running smoothly using whatever means necessary to protect Diddy's interests and his empire. For years, Diddy's team allegedly made sure everything stayed under wraps. This is where the RICO charges come into play. The prosecutors are saying that Diddy didn't just commit these crimes as an individual, he was at the head of an organized enterprise. Every act he's accused of, from the parties to the alleged violence, ties back to this broader network. under RICO, that makes him responsible for the whole thing, even if he wasn't personally involved in every single crime. The icing on the cake for the prosecution came when federal agents raided Diddy's Miami mansion. The other lawsuits, Diddy's past comes back to haunt him. As if the RICO charges weren't enough, Diddy's legal troubles go way beyond what's happening in the present. His past is coming back to haunt him in the form of multiple lawsuits, and the stories that are surfacing are painting a disturbing picture of the man behind the music mogul image. Some of these lawsuits are new, while others have been hanging over his head for years. But they all share one thing in common: they reveal a pattern of control and manipulation that's hard to ignore. This brings us to the lawsuit filed by Diddy's former producer, Lil Rod Jones. This one is particularly disturbing because it highlights not just Diddy's behavior but also how he allegedly treated the people he worked with. Jones claims that this happened over an extended period and left him feeling trapped. The details of Jones's lawsuit are graphic, and they paint a picture of a man who had no problem using his position. But the worst part is that this isn't an isolated case. It fits into a larger narrative that's been building for years, a narrative that Diddy has been using his power not just to succeed in the music industry, but to control the people around him. Jones's lawsuit was one of the first to peel back the curtain on what was really going on behind the scenes, but it wasn't the last one. One of the most damaging lawsuits to Diddy's reputation came from his ex-girlfriend, Cassie. Years ago, Cassie filed a lawsuit that detailed years of emotional and physical issues, and let me tell you, her story is hard to forget. According to Cassie, Diddy kept her under his thumb for years, controlling every aspect of her life. But it didn't stop there. What makes Cassie's story even more disturbing is that it shows a clear pattern of behavior that lines up with the current allegations against Diddy. For years, these stories were dismissed, but now that more evidence is coming to light, people are starting to see that Cassie's claims weren't just tabloid fodder, they were the real deal. And she wasn't the only one. After Cassie's lawsuit made headlines, more women started stepping forward with their own stories, and the picture of Diddy that's emerging is anything but flattering. Women from different walks of life are now coming forward, sharing stories that mirror Cassie's. Some of these cases have already been settled, while others are still making their way through the courts. But what's clear is that these lawsuits are casting a long shadow over Diddy's current legal battles. Even though some of these cases were settled out of court, the fact that they exist at all adds credibility to the newer accusations against him. It's like all the skeletons in Diddy's closet are finally coming out, and there's no way to put them back. For Diddy, these lawsuits are more than just a headache, they are a major blow to his defense in court. The prosecution can use these past cases to build a narrative that Diddy's behavior isn't a one-time thing, it's a pattern, a way of life. And that's exactly what they are doing. By highlighting his history of control, the prosecution is showing that Diddy's current charges aren't just some misunderstanding or an isolated incident, they are part of a much larger story, one that's been unfolding for years. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.